Coming up on Why Should I Trust You? Coleman Hughes is a thinker, writer, podcaster, and an author. You may know him from his Conversations with Coleman podcast with the Free Press, or from his appearances on CNN or The View, or from his recent book in which he, a young black intellectual, argues that America should strive as hard as possible to become colorblind, treating people without regard to race, ending affirmative action. He's been called a charlatan by some on the left, who say Coleman Hughes is ignoring deep systemic inequalities in this country. We'll discuss his ideas with him, but we're also intrigued by voices like Coleman's, who appear to go against what many assume should be their political tribe. It gets at something we think about a lot here on the show. All too often in our society, we take cues from our quote-unquote side and stick to a script, signing on to an opinion without really listening to the best version of an opposing viewpoint, sometimes more interested in getting approval from our own side. And that can be true for public health institutions as well as for supporters of MAHA. So today, we ask Coleman Hughes, what has he learned from being an unorthodox voice, upsetting the side of an argument that thought you were one of them? And ultimately, does he even think we can bridge our divides and rebuild trust? Let's get started. Hey, welcome everybody.
Welcome.
Hey guys.
It is really good to see everyone back here today. We have a terrific guest, y'all. I am so super excited. We have an intellectual in the house. We are going to intellect today. We are so happy to bring that conversation to you. Coleman Hughes, his Conversations with Coleman from the Free Press. I listen to it a lot. It is really terrific. You can check it out wherever you find podcasts. We're going to get to Coleman in a minute. Who are we? I am Brenda Adhikari.
Yeah, and I'm Tom Johnson.
I'm Maggie Bartlett.
And I'm Dr. Mark Abdul-Malik.
Yeah, Dr. Mark's a physician, medical reporter. Maggie's a virologist. Brenda and I are journalists. This is Why Should I Trust You? If you're a regular listener, you know this is a podcast that is trying desperately to make some sense of the breakdown in trust we're experiencing today in public health and medicine and science. And if there's anything we can do to bring that trust back, which we're hopeful there is.
Yeah. And look, Coleman he's not our typical guest. He's not like a virologist or an epidemiologist or particularly a MAHA supporter. But I think, I've been listening to Coleman's stuff for a while now, and he gets at some of the central conversations that we have in the show all the time, which is, why don't we trust the status quo and institutions as much as we once did in the past? He has addressed topics he has addressed topics like DEI and race in his work a lot, which also has come up in the world of science a lot these days with some of the cuts through DOGE. And so we're really excited to get into some of this stuff. So let's tell you a little bit about him. He is, like we said, the host of Conversations with Coleman at the Free Press. He's also a columnist writing about race, policy, and ethics. And he is actually with us. Coleman, just say hi real quick.
Hey guys, thanks for having me on.
Awesome to have you here. Just sit tight for a moment while we introduce you to our audience, and then we'll bring you in. Tom, take it away.
Yeah, the first thing to know about Coleman is that he's not yet 30 years old.
What the
Only got a few more months of that.
A few more months, but we're allowed to say it now.
Damn, Coleman.
The next thing, violinist, rapper, jazz trombonist with the Charles Mingus Tribute Band.
Are you kidding me?
2/3 of that is true. I don't play violin. I played violin when I was like 3 years old. I don't know.
Okay.
I don't know how that
counts.
We can count it.
We are
Where
playing
did you
two
find
truths
that?
and a lie. We're playing two truths and a lie.
Okay, perfect. Then you nailed it.
Coleman came on the national scene when he was still in college. So 2019, Congress holds a big hearing about the subject of reparations for Black Americans. I think it was about forming a committee to study it. Coleman was just 23 years old, still a student at Columbia University, opinion writer for Quillette, and he's invited by the House Republicans to come and speak on the issue. And if you go back and watch it, he is eloquent way beyond his years. And he makes the point that, this was a profound injustice that blacks were not compensated in the immediate wake of slavery. But to attempt reparations today was a mistake. He said black people don't need another apology. We need safer neighborhoods, better schools, less punitive criminal justice system, affordable health care, and none of those things can be achieved through reparations for slavery. And I thought what was really interesting in his testimony was he even addressed what it meant for him to be speaking out like this on this subject. And he said, nearly everyone close to me told me not to testify today. They said that even though I've only ever voted for Democrats, I'd be perceived as a Republican and therefore hated by half the country. Others told me that distancing myself from Republicans would end up angering the other half of the country. And the sad truth is that they were both right. That's how suspicious we've become of one another. That's how divided we are as a nation. And remember, this was a bunch of years ago. So Coleman went on writing, speaking, and in 2024, he published his first book. It's called The End of Race Politics, Arguments for a Colorblind America. In it, he argues that America's North Star should be a colorblind approach to race. So he explains that doesn't mean that we don't see race. Of course, we do see race. But, quote, the aim of color blindness is to consciously disregard race as a reason to treat individuals differently and as a category on which to base public policy. So in other words, America should move away from affirmative action policy approaches that give benefits or opportunities to one race. And, as you can imagine, that's a point of view coming from a young Black intellectual that made a lot of waves. It got a lot of attention and triggered a backlash. So you plug Coleman's name into Google and hit video, and up pops this View appearance where he's promoting his book. And one of the hosts said to him that many saw him as a charlatan who had been co-opted by the right. And Coleman diffuses that really with like clarity and simplicity and turns the conversation back to the subject and not this sort of unproven attack on him. It's worth watching. So in other words, Coleman is a guy who knows what it's like to go against the grain and to say what he believes, even if he knows he's going to be challenged over it.
Wow. Okay. So Coleman, we hope we got most of that right. It's really good to have you here. Like we said, we want you to listen to Conversations with Coleman, wherever you find your podcast, and pick up a copy of The End of Race Politics, Arguments for a Colorblind America. So Coleman Hughes, we want to get at first something that is kind of in our lane on this show when we talk about public health. And one of the points of division we have come across is this notion, this phrase, sort of loosely termed phrase, medical freedom versus a more traditional public health model. And for example, one example, Florida, which is taking this medical freedom stance, says that it wants to stop requiring public school children to prove that they've been vaccinated for a list of infectious diseases before enrolling in public school. They say, quote, they do not have the right to tell you what you can put in your body, and which traditional public health says is a terrible idea that's going to endanger children and, result in a dip in vaccination rates or allow viruses to reemerge. And look, we're not here to say like what you scientifically believe of this, but we have heard this phrase medical freedom come up a lot. And I wonder what you make of it and whether you think it's a proxy for something larger in our society today.
Yeah, I mean, so I was a philosophy major in college, and if you study philosophy or political philosophy in particular, you quickly come across the sort of John Stuart Mill classical liberal principle that I'm free to swing my fist, as the saying goes, but my freedom to swing my fist stops at your face. And this is a very good model for liberal societies on most issues. Like I'm an adult getting a tattoo. Right? Like why should I not be able to get a tattoo? It doesn't affect you, right? And moreover, I can get a tattoo that, say, offends your religion because I'm not forcing you to get the tattoo, right? If I want to get an upside down cross and I want to be like a Satan worshiper or whatever, I can do my thing as long as I'm not hurting you. And that intuition, not only does it deeply resonate with Americans in particular because our civic religion is based on liberty, which very few other places in the world have that. But it also makes a kind of sense, and it's worked very well, and a lot of other countries have bit by bit copied it. That model breaks down in a public health context when you're talking about contagious disease. It just does. It's contagious disease is by definition the case where my fist is hitting your face, right? Like my virus is getting into you. And if I don't get the vaccine, if a critical mass of people don't get the vaccine, I don't think I have to be a public health expert to understand the basic logic of outbreaks and herd immunity and so forth, and that it's all okay until it's suddenly not, until one or a hundred too many people don't get vaccinated, and then we're dealing with diseases that we haven't suffered from in 50 or 100 years. And so I guess my instinct is that having this hard and fast principle of I can do whatever the hell I want with my body, it's a great rule of thumb for adults until, like every rule of thumb that exists in philosophy, you meet the edge case where that rule of thumb no longer works. And so I am sympathetic to the idea that people have to get certain vaccinations, and specifically the ones that are tried and true and tested. That doesn't mean there's been no mistakes in public health history, and there haven't been vaccines that shouldn't have existed, and so forth. And you can talk about those cases, but I think it's probably just very easy for us modern people to lose sight of what life was like when people were just, being destroyed by smallpox and all these other viruses. So we kind of are lulled into this complacency. Um, and so that's my basic outlook on it.
Yeah. I wonder, Coleman, if you could share the story about your mom. I read a really compelling Substack, I think it was, that you wrote about your mom.
Mhm.
Um, and, we talked to a lot of people on the show, whether they're from MAHA or from public health. And so often people have an experience, and again, so often it's with a parent's health and a parent's interaction with medicines or the medical system that has profoundly shaped them and their view on things like medicine, modern
Mhm.
medicine, medical freedom. So I just wonder if you could just briefly share the story of your mom and just contemplate how it's shaped you.
All right. So I could there's a lot of stories that I could share, and not only from my mom but from other instances in my life. And many of the stories have morals and lessons that point in opposite directions. I have stories about terrible experiences at hospitals, but I guess I'll tell two stories that I think would be interesting to you guys and your audience. So this is not the story I told in that Substack, but my mother died when I was 18, almost 19 years old. She got breast cancer when I was 12, and eventually, so she got breast cancer when I was 12, and she got a mastectomy, and the cancer went into remission, and it was traumatic for our family, but she survived and she came out of it stronger, taking her health much more seriously. But the truly tragic part, and I think I've only ever said this on one other podcast because it's very painful for me to talk about, and I don't enjoy talking about it, but it's important, is that she got very enthralled, like Steve Jobs, with alternative medicine. And if she were around, I'm sure she would be able to give you an account of why that is. But having grown up in the South Bronx with, one of her brothers died of AIDS, the other's in and out of prison his whole life. She grew up in terrible circumstances in the worst hood in New York City and, in those days. I think she developed a sense of not trusting the system. And so she went for these, what I would consider today to be quack doctors. Um, and as a result of when she was in remission, seeing these quack doctors instead of seeing real doctors that would have kept tabs on the cancer, she saw this guy, I think Dr. Ali was his name, and I think he still has a practice in New York. And they don't do typical tests, and it was a nightmare. So 4 years later, she starts complaining of hip pain, and I tell her she should go to a chiropractor because I had a friend. I was a teenager at this time, but I had a friend that was like always talking about how amazing his chiropractor was. So I was like, you might as well try this. They do scans and find out that the cancer has returned and spread to her bones. And so she kind of pivots away from the pure alternative guy that's doing God knows what I don't even know what he's doing, to a facility in Arizona that does like some kind of mixed chemo mixed with a little bit of alternative stuff. So this was her bridge, sort of taking one step back to mainstream. And this is at this point I was probably 16 years old, and she didn't tell us the cancer had returned. She just left one day, and we didn't really know what was going on. It was a very difficult time. But she came back when I saw her again. I didn't see her for a couple months. When I saw her again, she was like 3 inches shorter, and her skeleton was asymmetric. One hip was higher than the other, and she was probably 30 pounds lighter. Like she looked like a different person. It was a very difficult thing for me to even talk about right now without tearing up. And she tried her very best, but eventually the cancer spread to her liver, and she died probably a year and a half after that. And I cannot help but shake the idea that if she had gone the mainstream route from the beginning, she would still be alive today. Because breast cancer caught early is not even close to a death sentence in the vast majority of cases. But if you let it become stage 4 bone cancer, you're toast. So I do have a very deep kind of well of anger and hurt over people that take distrust of the system so far that they end up pushing people to these alternative methods that end up getting people killed. So that was definitely a foundational experience for me. It's also it's given me, I think, a low tolerance for touchy-feely emotional bullshit, quack cures and all that stuff. But on the other hand, I've had experiences with hospitals. Like I'll give you one experience I had with my current fiance. This is years ago. She was having a problem with these like recurring cysts. And with this particular type of cyst that she had, it really mattered when the choice whether or not to get a surgery on it depended on how big the cyst had gotten. In other words, if it wasn't big enough, it wasn't worth doing the surgery. And this was the key decision matrix that you had to kind of, if you didn't catch it at the right time, it's actually better not to do the surgery. So we end up getting a consultation with some guy that's supposedly the best doctor at, the Columbia, the hospital next to Columbia University. We have a 15-minute consultation. He looks at her and he says, okay, he schedules in the surgery for Thursday, whatever it is. And it's all scheduled, it's all ready. And for some reason, I can't tell you why, I had some kind of instinct just to ask him one last time before we left the consultation. Hey, do you think she should, you sure she should get the surgery? And he says to me, I shit you not, with a straight face. He thinks for a minute, he goes, well, she probably shouldn't get it, but I like doing it.
What? Stop.
And it was like this, it sounds like a made up story, and like it literally sounds like a story you'd make up because you like hate mainstream medicine or something. It sounds like a hoax story, but like it actually
You're being
happened.
facetious, or like, I don't even like.
Well, crazy. Coleman, what's interesting about this and these two really powerful stories you've mentioned is that you, I think, encapsulate the entire conversation happening in this country.
Yeah.
Which is, on the one hand, having this very well-earned, perhaps frustration and resentment at a alternative medicine push. And then on the other hand, seeing that there's a medical community that somehow is being so glib over, like, so With that in mind, as somebody who's really studying, the political landscape at the moment, we are a show that has so many conversations with the Maha movement, and we have our own theories on this. But why do you think that this movement is ascendant at the moment, and that Robert F. Kennedy has aligned with Donald Trump, and that this is something that feels in some ways like this inevitable wave that is present in our country today?
Yeah, it's a great question. Anti-vax. My mom was a basically anti-vaxxer before it was cool. She wasn't like she got us vaccinated, but she was always talking to us about how like, vaccines are kind of bullshit, and but she wasn't like a but this used to be a left-wing opinion, as you know. My mom was basically a communist. She would never come within 10 inches of voting for a Republican, and this was her view. Um, the yeah, the Maha movement, at some level, one of the most interesting things about COVID is that American politics gets exported all over the world. Like if you go to Sweden or Australia or the UK, it's just like they're having mostly carbon copies of the debates that we have here, just like a month after we have them. Except America was really the only country where we had this massive split on the vaccines, where it just became a totally polarized issue. And if you're to trace it to a cause, I mean, I think it was just downstream of the actual polarization crisis that we had reached by that point, which is to say, I'm curious if you guys agree with this, but from my memory of COVID, there at the very beginning there was no political polarization about it at all. It was just like everyone was like, "Oh, are the death rates 5% or 1%? Like, shoot, like we gotta figure this thing out." And then within about a week, it sort of became like the right is minimizing COVID and the left is maximizing COVID.
Yeah.
But then when Trump announces Operation Warp Speed and he's trying to push the vaccine forward, it's actually people on the left that are skeptical of the vaccine. It's like Kamala and Joe Biden saying, well, I don't know if I trust that vaccine if Trump is the architect.
Yeah, or is he racing it out before the election? Remember that?
Yeah, he's racing it out. It's not going to, they were implying heavily that it's not going to be safe because he's racing it out. To my knowledge, no one on the right was really doing that. Then everything changes when Trump loses the election and the vaccine ends up coming out under the auspices of the Democrats. This somehow gives the American right the license and the reason, just as Kamala and Joe Biden had just recently done, to go all in on saying, well, we don't trust any of the public health institutions, which, to be fair, are probably, like most institutions, more populated by Democrats on average than Republicans. And so it's like a side effect of that basic polarization that the issue turned out that way. And I think also Republicans, the Republican Party in particular under Trump, has drawn enormous energy from not trusting experts, not trusting the establishment, not trusting the elites. Because however you slice it, experts, the establishment, the elites skew Democrat rather than Republican. And in some instances, like college campuses, have skewed so far to the left that the conclusions they end up coming up to end up actually being just wrong a lot of the time, because you can't really get at the truth if you only include half of the perspectives in the conversation.
I think on some of that COVID stuff, Coleman, I think you're spot on. Some of the touchstones that we have seen, look, in those first few months, especially here in New York, we were all like banging our pots and pans for the healthcare workers, and mostly people were pretty compliant with the lockdown all across the country, actually. And in those first, and as we know that like the waves happened in pockets, it hit the Northeast first, and then so on and so forth. But there were a couple of touchstones that we look at, which is like one, when increasingly there was this debate about the origins of the virus, that was a real kind of splitting point for a lot of the country. It ended up being this kind of political cleavage between people who thought it was a lab leak and people who thought it was the wet market. Then once like when the virus came out and there was a wave that hit where people were still getting infected, or excuse me, when the vaccine came out and then the wave hit and people were still getting the infection, that ended up being another cleavage point. And then certainly the perception of mandates and lockdowns. And one other thing, Tom and I, when we were developing the show, we noticed just a few months before the outbreak in Wuhan, we had, remember that like Boeing hearing of like all the plane crashes?
Yeah, like the parts falling off the planes.
The parts falling off the planes. And look, we're journalists, and so we're going to look at particular like touchstones and cultural and political touchstones. But we were just remembering that like that these things that we fly and that we trust are literally falling out the sky like one after the other, right? This company is doing that. And we're holding these hearings because we didn't trust the people in charge of a thing that we rely on to keep us safe. And it was just interesting to us that like literally the next month we hear about an outbreak at Wuhan. I want to get a little bit just further into some of the things you've said, you know, specifically in terms of like the phrase DEI, race. We are in a period now, and forgive me, I don't have like the numbers on me, and Mark, if you guys have this, help me out here, but like, you know, many in the scientific and public health community are like, they're really just really upset right now and really pissed off at the facts that like their grants have been terminated because somewhere in the grant, the phrase DEI was mentioned. And some of them even tell us that like, they can't even say not even DEI, which has become this like toxic kind of like loaded phrase in our culture now, but that they can't even mention talk of race. But take us back. Like, what is the best case argument here for stripping these grants of these words and stripping the grants themselves? And do you think that that was the right course of action?
Yeah, so DEI is like a huge topic. I think the first thing I would say to put it into context is that the backlash doesn't come from nowhere. It comes from years of DEI being forced down people's throats. And so, for instance, I forget if it was the University of California system or some other college system, many colleges, in fact, for years were requiring faculty that wanted to work there to sign DEI pledges. In other words, you want to teach physics at University of California, Santa Barbara? Well, sign a pledge to the sacred value of diversity, equity, and inclusion, which in practice often means policies like race-based affirmative action that a majority of Americans actually don't agree with, and has, every time it's put on a state referendum, lost, including in blue states like California twice, right? So there was a certain elite consensus that, you know, every liberal elite likes DEI basically, and liberal elites constitute like 2% of the country. And there was this assumption that, well, because we like this idea that we have to, every space should prize racial diversity, even sometimes at the sacrifice of merit, that everyone has to agree with this. And no doubt, I have to imagine a lot of those people putting DEI into their grant were doing it because they thought maybe it'll help their chances with someone, right? Not because it was the product. Their research was truly geared towards DEI. I know a little bit about how tough the grant writing process is and how competitive it is, and what you have to do in order to sell somebody on your idea, even if it's actually a great idea, it might not. So all that said, I don't trust Trump's blunt force hammer approach to almost any domestic policy issue. So for instance, he's going after the Smithsonian Museum. This is like a perfect example of the pattern I'm talking about. The pattern I'm talking about is basically the left has controlled most of the meaning-making institutions, your colleges, your probably disproportionately your local public school, your local museums, Hollywood, every channel on TV except Fox News, on and down, on and on. Those are all left-leaning. And the right hates that. And they're like, you guys think you're being objective, but you're actually being biased. So when we get into power, we're going to pass 1,000 executive orders mandating that the culture changes in a right-wing direction according to our values. And that inevitably overreaches because some of that stuff isn't even constitutional. Some of it's just heavy-handed. Some of it is like Trump tweeting things that he's literally not allowed to do. And and so you can't understand that without understanding, I think, where it comes from. But like the Smithsonian, just to finish, I'll be quick, is a good example because like the Smithsonian, for example, the African American History Museum, which is great and was constructed like 8 years ago, was finished 8 years ago. They have an exhibit on slavery, which is mostly a very good exhibit. In 2020, the Smithsonian Museum put up a graphic on its website about what it called like white supremacy culture or whiteness culture. And the graphic explained that whiteness culture is things like working hard, planning for the future, objective linear thinking, like grammatically correct speech. Like all this stuff, it was saying basically you can't expect black people, Hispanic people to like think in objective linear terms or like work hard to plan for a goal. It was like the most racist thing you could possibly imagine. It was one of those situations where you had gone so far left that you had like somehow looped around and gotten to like white supremacy through the back door. And this stayed up on the website for 6 weeks, this insane critical race theory stuff. And people are looking at this saying, what is going on with a government funded institution like the Smithsonian having this nonsense? And then Trump gets to power. He says, well, I'm going to change the Smithsonian. I'm going to mandate in an executive order that they get rid of divisive ideologies and they get rid of all this stuff. Very vague language, right? What does it mean? What's a divisive ideology? How do you legislate that? It's very, very tough to do, right? And he doesn't control the Smithsonian board. He can't just fire people. And so this is a perfect example of the pattern of the left not realizing that it's overreaching with what is essentially a religion of the left that doesn't see it as a religion, but it's like a civic religion of woke DEI. And then the right trying to just hammer it down with blunt force legislation that doesn't actually really work, creates backlash, and is often heavy-handed, and there's casualties in the blunt force trauma of those laws. And some of the casualties might be, for instance, really good research projects that get axed just because it has the word DEI in it.
So it sounds like that actual outcome of using that blunt force is not something that you think is particularly effective. But what I'm also hearing you say is there is this problem on many colleges and universities of maybe kind of a blind, like a blind following of a certain diversity philosophy. But I guess help me understand what a better approach could look like. And what do you also say? And I know you've thought about this a lot, Coleman. So, what do you say to people who say that, in universities for far too long, where you've had mainly white male academic kind of faculty who are tenure track, that some of these voices haven't really been kind of centered in any of these conversations? What do we do to at least make it so that that diversity in some capacity is invited?
So sorry. Okay, your first question is like, what's the better way? Okay, I'll take those questions in reverse order then. So I would say it just hasn't been true for a long time on elite college campuses that racial diversity in the faculty is a big problem. It used to be a huge issue. It's just not anymore. I mean, I went to Columbia University. I saw no lack of Black and Hispanic and Asian and non-white faces all over campus, from the faculty to the administrators to the students. So I would say that this is a way of fighting a war that has already been won. And at some point, there has to be a recognition that that war has been won, and a kind of honesty that because there are some, I think, who would prefer to fight the war forever because it feels good to do so.
Is what is happening now gonna take away that experience you had?
Not necessarily. So, I mean, if you're talking about the student body, if you get rid of racial preferences, I think that does rejuggle the students throughout the system, right? Because like when California, we have evidence when California got rid of a state of affirmative action in the state schools, the UCAL systems in '96, what it meant is there was less Black and Hispanic kids going to, say, the top, the top UCAL school and more going to the school right below that. So it was a reshuffling of students throughout the system as opposed to a net loss of Black and Hispanic students going to college. And it's always good. I like to blow people's mind with this statistic. This is from Thomas Espenshade, the Princeton sociologist who wrote this in his New York Times op-ed and his book about affirmative action. What percent of African American 18-year-olds every year do you think get into a college as a result of affirmative action?
Mm-hmm.
Take a mental guess or an actual one if you want.
Say it
As
again.
a
What
result
percent of
of
what?
affirmative
Say it one more time.
What percent of all Black 18-year-olds in the country this year get into a college as a result of an affirmative action
But
policy?
first, we have to ask what percent of Black 18-year-olds go to college?
Sure. Yes,
What
that's right.
percent of Black 18-year-olds go to a quote unquote competitive college in which it would matter
Exactly.
to make that sort of application?
Exactly. And what do you think that
20%.
number
Say
is?
a low
No,
number.
20%?
tiny,
10.
tiny,
10?
tiny,
Okay.
tiny.
Any other guesses?
2,
1.
1.
The percent is 1% because 99% either don't graduate high school, do graduate high school, or and don't go to college, or do go to a college but go to a big state school that doesn't do affirmative action because it has
Or
a
community
high,
college. Yeah, exactly.
or a community college or any. So what we're talking about is
Wait a minute. So so if the number is so low, do we, I guess, as a society think that's a problem? I guess I'm going to ask you that. Do you think that's a problem that it's 1%? That they're not
No,
going
but
to.
the point is that only 1% are even in a position to benefit from such programs. Like it's like Black upper middle class people like me from Montclair, New Jersey, that are applying to Harvard and Columbia
Yeah.
with
Right.
with some within reaching distance of the kind of scores that might get me in. I'm the kind of kid who needs no help from the government because I grew up upper middle class,
Right.
that gets in as
You
a
were
result of affirmative action.
overcoming some socioeconomic hurdle
Cor-
that puts
cor-
you at a disadvantage. If you needed a tutor, you probably got a tutor. If you needed an
Exactly,
SAT help, you got
exactly.
SAT help.
And
Yeah.
those are the
You're
kind of
saying we're solving the wrong problem.
I'm saying affirmative action has nothing, and corporate DEI basically has nothing to do with the problem of, say, Black poverty, intergenerational Black poverty, intergenerational poverty in general. What we think of when we think of the legacy of slavery is not whether I get into Harvard or not. We're thinking about neighborhoods in America where kids grow up with crime and drugs in the street, hopeless, despair, terrible schools. That's the problem we have to be focusing on. It is a totally separate conversation from affirmative action, and yet affirmative action and DEI get all this airtime, both supporters and critics. And why is that?
Yeah.
Because the people who decide what gets airtime are who? Elites like me, people that write in the New York Times, people that work at CNN, people that work at Fox. So we write about the stuff that like matters to us, but we use the moral authority that you can kind of suck from making it seem like it's related to these issues of the legacy of slavery and poverty, but it's really not.
But Coleman, do you think that healthcare is a way that we might need a little help here? We might need a loophole. We might need a caveat here because there is like real consequences of not studying disease states in underrepresented populations. For example, melanoma, it's a rare disease, but in African American patients, it gets diagnosed much later at a more advanced stage. Same thing with breast cancer. You talked about your mom. What about, hypertension that only affects the Black population in a certain way, or kidney disease? All of those are examples of disease states that we do need to understand more. And the only way to fund those is through a DEI kind of phrasing.
Because Mark, you're saying for many of those disease states, you can't study it through the lens of just socioeconomics because there actually is a race component or a racial component to it as well.
I totally agree with that. You not get any argument from me on that. I think that,
but that's affirmative action in terms of resources, in terms of
yes, but he's saying that that's a carve.
It's not affirmative action. Affirmative action is when you're judging two people for a job or a position at a college, and you give one extra points or less points because of their racial identity. What you're talking about is the phenomenon that humans vary genetically based on the fact that we all used to be one people in Africa, and then we were separate for tens of thousands of years, and that has a genetic legacy which is real and affects disease incidence across different populations. And doctors have to be armed with that knowledge if they're gonna treat their patients in the best way. In
But those
principle,
grants have been canceled, like cystic fibrosis.
yeah.
grants
So
have been
I think that's a terrible
sickle cell disease. Sorry, have been canceled.
So this goes to DEI being an umbrella term. There has to be a way that we can say no to the physics teacher having to sign a DEI pledge to teach physics. Yes to the person trying to study cystic fibrosis.
I'm sorry, sickle cell disease.
It's trying to study sickle cell and help doctors identify it or identify melanomas better in Black patients. Like, there has to be a sane way where we can create two different words for that so that we don't confuse them on the national stage.
Do you think that that's like a purposeful, or just like a mistake that this administration's doing? Is there something purposeful about it and intentional?
I just think they're careless. I don't think they think very hard about a lot of the things that they're doing. I mean, Trump, attention to detail, no one has ever argued who has ever worked with Donald Trump that attention to detail is his fortitude, or that including people that are fans of him.
Yeah. You mentioned Trump, and I've heard you say on one of your recent podcasts that Trump, I think it was something like, has taken voters to a place they didn't know they wanted to go. And there, obviously, you just described the downstream effects of that. And I wonder if you can, just to tie this back to health, are there thoughts about, the MAHA movement or the medical freedom movement or Secretary Kennedy, and that same, line that, that movement has taken Americans who need healthcare, who want to go to their doctor, to a place they didn't know they wanted to go. Like right now, we're seeing so much, for example, chaos with the vaccine recommendations, or, now the mandates that are gone away, or, all of these changes that we're seeing. Is that a place like what does that mean now? Like, are we in a place that Americans didn't want to necessarily go to by following this movement?
Yeah, it's a good question. I don't know how it's all going to shake out. I think you guys would probably know more than I do. I I like the idea that Americans should take seriously eating healthier, because that used to be kind of like a left-wing coded thing as well. That was kind of like Michelle Obama's bag, and now the right is talking about it. So I like that aspect of MAHA. I think the government should probably provide Ozempic to like half of America, and that would solve most of our downstream health problems.
But that's not MAHA.
That's not MAHA. I don't know what that is. That's why I'm running for president. No, that's what I would do.
Wait, what?
Free
Breaking
Ozempic
news,
for
everyone.
free Ozempic for every American, because how many of our massive healthcare problems are just downstream of the fact that we're the most obese country in the world relative to our peers.
Yeah, but I will say, just to jump into that with Mark, just on Mark, like, because I'm just gonna like pretend that I'm being interviewed for a second. But what Coleman said about what Coleman said about Trump, I think can be applied to folks from MAHA for Kennedy, because I think that there is this, no matter what people think about the specific policies that are being said, there is a force taking place right now, which is like this anti-establishment, corporate influence is corrupting us, that medications, are being pushed on us by pharmaceutical companies who we learned to distrust during the opioid epidemic. And there's just like this massive move right now that I think in some ways the country didn't even know that it was looking for. That, I mean, there's one poll that suggests that potentially 15 to 20% of the electorate is kind of MAHA curious at the moment. And, that's not a tiny number. So I would just put that out there. Tom, you had something you wanted to jump in with.
Yeah, and I don't want to go too deep into this, but it just struck me as you were talking about affirmative action. Like, that is, granting a benefit to one racial group over another. What about this thing that's now a subject in terms of the government shutdown of the cuts to Medicaid?
Hmm.
So Black people are disproportionately recipients of Medicaid.
Hmm.
Does the opposite work if we knowingly cut a benefit like Medicaid that we know is going to disproportionately hurt a certain racial group? Is that just as bad as knowingly giving a benefit to a certain racial group?
Well, so no, they're not the same because one is actually being done on the basis of race, and one has a racial disproportion as a side effect, which literally every policy you can name federally does, right? Cut any federal policy, and you will find it doesn't affect the same number of whites, blacks, Asians, and Hispanics as would appear in a census chart, right? So this was like Ibram Kendi's argument, who is a big writer who wrote the book How to Be an Anti-Racist. His argument was to collapse the distinction that I just made. In other words, he wants to say cutting Medicaid, which is a like means tested poverty based policy, if that influences more than 13, if more than 13% of the people influenced are black, that's the same as if you literally just morally, that's the same as if you cut Medicaid for black people specifically. Because everyone would identify cutting Medicaid for black people only as a purely racist policy. It'd be illegal, obviously, but it would also be offensive to the post civil rights morality of the country. But we actually can't do policy if we consider that to be the same as having a means tested income based policy that has a racial disproportion. I'm not saying cutting Medicaid. I'm not enough of
Yeah, yeah,
an
yeah.
expert to like rule on whether that's smart at all, but
You're
And
saying if someone is disproportionately affected by something, it is not the same thing as having an intentional policy to harm that person.
correct.
Right.
right,
Yeah.
the trust issue that we focus on, though, when you layer in $50 billion being carved out just for rural health, rural hospitals, at the same time as we're cutting Medicaid overall, like I think it's a driver of mistrust, I guess, that some groups are benefiting, rural's benefiting and are getting something as like a band-aid, frankly. But I want to ask you a different question now. You sort of live as an independent
Well, I want to
thinker.
say
Yeah,
before
yeah,
your question, can I just
yeah,
make one point?
sure.
I understand that. That makes sense to me that people feel more trust when they feel less trust when they feel a policy benefits others more than them. But this goes in every direction on the political spectrum. For instance, the classic argument from Trump supporters is that globalization benefited some people and hurt all those post-industrial towns. And so if you take that to its conclusion, it basically justifies, anything and everything, including two terms of Trump, to say, well, they hate us and their policies benefited them and not us. And there's some truth to all of it, but it's just worth flagging. It goes in every direction.
Sure. So we on the show bring Maha folks on, we bring veteran public health folks on, we get them to talk, we talk. Often when the mics go off, both sides independently say to us, I'm worried what like my side's going to say about me having come on
Mm,
here and talked.
mm.
I imagine that's something you were pretty expert on, like having being bold to sort of reach across and talk to other people or carve out an independent lane. I mean, just how corrosive do you think the policing of your side, being seen as you're portraying your side, if you have a thought that kind of breaks with orthodoxy of your side? Can you just talk a little bit about your experience with that?
I mean, what you just described is absolutely ubiquitous. It's a cancer on the industry of us talkers in public. And I've had the exact same experience with people. You hear one thing on TV, you hear one thing here, and then you're having a beer later, and it's like they're just complaining about how nuts people are on their own side. And I'm like, well, where was all this? Where is all this when, you had the ability to do something about it? I mean, I think you're seeing this on the right wing now with all of these absolutely insane anti-Semitic conspiracy theory, Tucker Carlson, Candace Owens, Fever Swamp craziness that I know a lot of right wingers who are, a few inches more sane than them don't agree with. but aren't really pushing back against, right? So, and God knows it happens on the left. I mean, we just saw, I don't know if maybe you guys have already talked about it on the podcast, but Malcolm Gladwell came out last week and he said he was so terrified a few years ago in that debate, whatever the debate was or podcast he was on, to say that he doesn't believe biological men should play as trans women with cis women in sports, right? And Malcolm Gladwell, I mean, he's no slouch. He's got, from all those books, if he doesn't have
Free
fuck you
thinker.
money, it's
Yeah.
his fault. I'm pretty sure he has fuck you money. And still,
He
a
has
guy
fuck
like
you money.
him, yeah, and a guy like him was cowed on this trans issue to say something that he knew not to be true. And so, what hope do the rest of us have? So it's a huge problem.
Yeah.
Well, let me ask you, in context of the murder of Charlie Kirk, there's been conversations. I'm thinking of the latest one with Ezra Klein and Ta-Nehisi Coates, but specifically this idea of, do we think there need to be lines drawn of like shit we shouldn't be able to say? Like there's free speech absolutism, and then there's like, what if your speech feels violent to someone, like feels like you're saying something that is really like, I mean, it sounds soft when I'm saying it, but that it's really upsetting. It feels like an attack to someone, right?
Mhm.
And what was interesting is that, I mean, I think I'm just paraphrasing here. I mean, Ta-Nehisi said that like there are lines, and Ezra was like, I think we're living in a country now where I don't think there are lines. And so I guess my question, because we come up with this, we come against this all the time, that if we bring someone on who has factually unsupported claims about, let's say, vaccinations, and we're not necessarily doing some kind of a hard-hitting interview with them, but we're there to sort of hear where they're coming from, and then you bring that on with someone else who is perhaps someone in public health who they may have a way of thinking about something, and then later we find out that something they said may not be 100% like it's real muddled these days about this idea of there being a group that thinks even engaging feels like you're crossing a line. I don't know the answer, Coleman. What do you think about this?
My view, okay, one, I'm a free speech pretty much absolutist, meaning I think the First Amendment is a great idea, and it's looking better and better every single day that America has a First Amendment. When you look at what's happening, for instance, in the UK, our mother country in a way, very similar culture to ours in many respects, and they are bringing grandma to the police station for making a mean Facebook comment about Muslims. Like that's actually what's happening over there, which is crazy and terrible, and it's happening widespread. It doesn't get enough coverage. That can't happen in America because we have a First Amendment. And, if you're unsympathetic to the grandma that doesn't like Muslim immigrants, just understand that soon enough the shoe will be on the other foot, and the right wingers will have the same power to drag you before the cops for saying, something nasty about someone the left cares about or the right cares about. So to that extent, that's how I feel about that. I do think culturally we should have taboos. I don't want people to go around shouting the N-word, and I understand there's something arbitrary about that, but it's a taboo that reflects a real history of our country, and it represents a value of having gone past a certain kind of bigotry that plagued the country for a long time. And in any event, it's like every culture has its taboos. Let's not pretend we are any different. So I think a culture can enforce a taboo through cultural means, through if someone shows up, a white guy shows up in blackface on Halloween with big red painted lips, you don't beat him up. It's still a crime to beat him up, but you tell him, dude, what the fuck is wrong with you? Right? You exercise your free speech, and if enough people do that, you can enforce certain taboos and red lines without violence. So I'm okay with that. When it comes to basically, I believe in platforming people, including conspiracy theorists. Well, platforming is already giving away the ball game, because the idea is they don't have a platform without you, which in this age we all know I think is bullshit at this point.
Right.
The internet has lowered the barrier of communicating to zero. You used to have to get a platform to some extent. Now you don't.
We
You
still
just
hear
go
this
on
though. We
YouTube.
still hear you're platforming. What are you doing?
Yeah,
What are you doing? It's like, no,
yeah.
they
I'm
are.
platforming Candace Owens.
Right.
She gets 2 million views. More people watch her show than probably watch CNN every day. And she did not need any institution really to get that. She just needed a YouTube channel.
This is the same thing I say about Megyn Kelly and Tucker Carlson, who were two people that once they left their networks are now more influential and bigger than they've ever been.
Exactly. They got deplatformed and now they're reaching more people. So I think I'm okay with platforming people. I think the way to combat dumb speech is with better speech, but I think you do have a responsibility to the best of your ability to prepare for your guests that you know are going to speed run misinformation at you, to try to do your homework and be able to combat that in real time. I think that's very important because I think it's a false choice between like not platforming and just letting them say anything with no pushback. I think the best thing to do is to give them a chance to say what they say. But if they say something that you like, I read RFK's like whole book, his big book on vaccines, like Thimerosal, Let the Evidence Speak or whatever. And he got a couple things right in those book that I hadn't known before because I double checked every footnote. He also got a lot of shit wrong that if you just follow the footnotes, you say, actually, that study does not say what you say it said, right? So obviously it's a lot of work if you're doing, you know, several podcasts a week, and it would take a whole organization really to fact check someone in real time. It's not possible to do perfectly when you're dealing with kind of like a crank.
There's so
But
much resistance to fact checking, though. That itself, you start to hear people criticize you, even just for fact checking. Well, you're just censoring me. It's just, you're an expert, by degree, but that doesn't mean you have expertise. There's so much backlash to just the fact check. Like, we don't even agree on the facts anymore.
yeah, well, I guess fact checking got a bad rap, or a bad rep, I should say, because a lot of fact checks like have turned out not to be fair or true.
So you have to
Like,
fact check the fact check.
yeah, you have to like who's fact checking the fact checkers.
Oh my
And
God, Coleman, my head is spinning. I just want to quit. I just want to
no,
quit.
but it's true. I mean, there have been many cases from the past 10 years where you go to Snopes or you go to whatever these other websites, and if you know enough, you actually know that the fact check is not correct in this case. Although they do a decent job, to give them credit. But yeah, I mean, I think community notes is a good thing on Twitter, all things considered. I've
See,
always thought,
I sort of feel, Coleman, that we're sort of being set up to fail by the internet. Like there really is no way to win, even on fact checks, because the different layers of judgment are just always there. And I'm kind of a mind now of, can we at least create trusted communities where we kind of have these conversations amongst ourselves and we at least have some semblance of respect? Like if we are going to create certain online spaces, it could be WhatsApp groups, it could be kind of smaller centers of dialogue where we can kind of keep each other real. But like when it's just out in the internet, or even when, I don't know, I'm not sure if that makes sense or not. But look, I want to give you one final question to think about here. I want to bring it back to politics. You've often talked about this two-party system not really being one that represents this country, and that, I want to talk a little bit about, like, do we feel like there are things right now that are being left on the table that whoever picks it up could have a real shot at making some real action? And what I mean when I say that is, to me, I look at, things like just medical costs. I look at frustrations with, I'm blanking here, so I'm going to stick to medical costs.
Cuts to
Okay.
scientific funding. I mean, are these things jump ball? Could the Democrats weigh in on this and not just be defenders of Obamacare, but actually, could they compete in the health space the way the Republicans have grabbed hold of this? I think that's
or any issue out there that you think, like right now, both the Republicans and Democrats are a little bit asleep at the wheel on a couple of things, and whoever kind of jumps into this fray is going to be in for a real like a real force behind them?
That's a really good question. I struggle off the top of my head because the easy thing is to like substitute things that I think are a big issue and then just like be like, oh yeah, the country will agree with me, but it's really kind of a pet frustration of mine. Like I think,
We can start there.
okay, so one thing that's a pet frustration of mine is teachers' unions because people always ask me, and this is the last chapter of my book, like, okay, so you're talking all about rethinking racial inequality and color blindness and all the conversations we're having. Well, what do we actually do? Like, how can we actually help poor kids in this country to the extent that we can? And I always cite this study by Harvard economist Roland Fryer, where he got the rare opportunity to take over a randomly selected group of like a dozen lowest performing schools, public schools in Houston, mostly poor Black and Hispanic kids that go to these schools. A lot of them don't have fathers in the home. A lot of them come from neighborhoods with crime and poverty and drugs. And what he got to do is fire half the teachers, fire all the principals, extend the school day, give every kid more tutoring, all this stuff that is impossible because of unions. And he was able to raise their test scores by an amount, I forget the exact number, but an amount that was shocking relative to most such studies. And so I do think like people are always looking for the policy solution, the lever that we can pull in order to improve the lives of poor, struggling kids in this country. And the truth is, you can't really reach into someone's home and give them a more functional home life, right? Because there are privacy concerns there and abuse of power concerns there. But you do have them for 6 or 7 hours a day at school. So what can be done to make these schools more functional? And so one of my personal pet issues is just the absolute strangle that teachers' unions have over the Democratic Party and the fact that any reform to public education in America that doesn't benefit teachers is going to get absolutely destroyed by the power of that union. And like very few people talk about it.
Well,
We
look,
need a new
I'll
episode for
add.
that.
That's a whole
That's a whole
Well,
episode.
can of worms.
I'll add to that. You know, the conversation around education in this country has been so dominated by colleges and what happens inside colleges and the current kind of rhetoric about DEI and all that stuff, which, by the way, it's a worthwhile conversation. But as a mom to an 8-year-old and a 13-year-old, when I think about primary education, secondary education, high school, kind of setting the framework for these kids to go to college and the frustrations we have in those spaces, you know, I do agree with you. I don't know that either party is fully like taking the issues of just regular public school education as like a force amplifier in this country. Um, I mean, do you think that the way things are going right now, we are basically in store for generations of MAGA to come because it is from a media perspective, from a Gen Z perspective, from a cultural perspective, it is just resonating more deeply.
Mm, yeah, I don't think so, only because um, first, I think it's always a good guess that the people in power are going to screw it up badly enough to alienate the people that liked them. Um, as Americans, we always want whatever we weren't just having. So that's why we always flip-flop parties pretty much every 8 years. I mean, the only time like I mean, it's only George H.W. Bush that was able to take the handoff from Reagan. Every other time in my lifetime, and probably all of your lifetimes too, we switch, right? We go back and forth and back and forth. Not only that, I think Trump is singular in his ability to amass a loyal following. He's a politician of rare talent, similar to Obama in that way, similar to Clinton. I don't. I personally don't see JD Vance inspiring a loyal following akin to Trump, and I don't see who's next. I don't see who would be next and who would follow. I think MAGA is nothing without Trump. It falls apart at the seams, and that that only has so much staying power.
Well, listen, Coleman, we are so thrilled that you joined us today. And you just say it like it is, and we're very appreciative of being able to have these honest conversations with you here. Thank you so much, Coleman Hughes, for joining
Thank
us on
you.
Why Should I Trust You?
Thank you for having me.
So that is our show today. I am Brenda Adhikari. He is Tom Johnson. He is Dr. Mark. She is Maggie Bartlett. That was Coleman Hughes, Conversations with Coleman. Check out his book. We'll put everything in the show notes. Please send us questions, comments to questions@whyshoulditrustyou.net, and we will see you right back here next week.